What's up, guys? My name's Wes, and this is Piece Parts. And in this episode, we're gonna get this wiring situated, figure out once and for all. So, it's gonna be a long one. Buckle up, but I promise it's gonna be worth it. So, here we go.
Alright, so let's jump into some wiring. So I took a couple screws and screwed them into my workbench right here so that I have a place to kind of hook the harness on here. I did the same right there as well. That way I can kind of drape the harness on my workbench. So there's, the rest of it. This is the Ranger wiring harness that I got from the whole front half of the Ranger. So my plan of attack, first of all, is to start taking off things like the lights. I know I'm not going to use them from this harness. So I figured that's a pretty good place to start, getting into the harness to get the wiring for the lights out, and then I can get to some other plugs that I just know are non-essential and start pulling those out. But I'm going to start with the lights first because I definitely know I'm not going to use those. So, let's go.
Okay, so at this point, I realized that the project started to get pretty daunting, and luckily for me, there's a lot of available resources online. There's a bunch of different wiring diagrams, mostly for different years. So I had to do a bunch of research to try to figure out the exact stuff that changed, because in '92, I believe, is when they started the distributorless ignition system, and then in '93, there was a body change on the Rangers. So some of the stuff is different and it's specific to '92, and so I had to find the right stuff, and luckily I found a few different things that had the right wiring diagrams for certain things, especially the ignition system. There's a lot of stuff on that, which is awesome. So I was able to use some of that, and then I also found a electrical vacuum and troubleshooting manual specifically for a '92 Ranger. Ford released these every year, I believe, and so they're specific to the model year, and so I bought that on eBay for a few bucks, and it was super worth it. I go into it a little bit later, but at this point I had the harness mostly stripped down. I took off a bunch of the big sections of loom and then laid it in the car just to try to get a rough idea. I had kind of mocked it up on the engine on the stand before, but it's a lot different when it's sitting in the car and you can only get to certain things and things like that. So that's where we're at right here, and let's get back to it.
Okay, so I set the Ranger wiring harness kind of roughly where I think things will go. I know of a few things that plug in right. I know the mass airflow sensor and the IoT sensors plug in right there. I know that my ignition coil plugs in right here. I know some other things that plug in, the ignition control module, things like that. And I plugged all those connectors in about where I think, and kind of laid the harness about how I think it would have gone. What I'm going to do is start kind of going through some of the stuff that I know I don't need. I've already kind of started a while back with some of the headlight and blinkers and marker lights. All that kind of wiring is all this stuff, and I kind of just bundled it up there. But I basically recognize the connectors as a headlight plug, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't need that. And so that's kind of what I'm going through. And this right here, this bundle of wires here, this main bundle of wires was actually in this large connector right here, and so basically what I did was I unpinned that and pulled all those wires out of there. This, I believe, connected into the firewall and kind of was a main connection source between the engine bay and the rest of the truck. But I'm not going to use most of the stuff in there. I believe a lot of this is lights and things like that. So my plan of attack is to start with things that I know I don't need, get rid of those. There's these two sets of these really twisted wires here, and they go to a plug just like this, and there's no one right over there. And the wiring is unbroken from there up into this plug. So I'm pretty certain that, like, basically there's just a plug into another plug, and that tells me that I don't need that whole setup, if that makes sense. And so kind of what I'm going to do is more stuff like that, and that I know it doesn't really connect to anything else, that would have only connected into the cab and to a light or something like that. So that I found some helpful things online. There's a nice old forum post of a guy doing a standalone eec-iv harness, or EEC4 or EEC4, whatever you want to call it, harness out of an F-150, and kind of stripping it down. It's a little bit different because it didn't have the distributorless stuff like the four-cylinder does, but some of the stuff is still the same. He had the same looking plug, and was able to kind of narrow down some of the stuff out of the plug that he needs. So I'm going to kind of use some of his reference. I also found some wiring diagrams online, which I've printed out, and I'm going to use those to try to help figure out what I do need to actually run the engine. And then hopefully after everything's said and done, what I can do is spin the engine over and test for spark, test the injectors, and make sure I have those two things, fuel, spark, and then compression, and I believe the thing should fire. That's what I'm going to try to do. I don't think I'm going to film trying to pull out some of those wires. It's relatively self-explanatory. Obviously, I already cut off all the insulation and wrapping for a lot of this stuff, but some more of it I will get deeper into it.
Okay, so to try to figure out circuits to eliminate, what I did was I plugged everything in that I could find. Everything that had a sensor or whatever on the engine, I plugged the connector in from the harness. That way I knew it was taken up by something. And in the situations where I didn't have something plugged into it, basically what I did was either use my multimeter to try to figure out where the wire went, and if it was pinned into the ECU, and if it was pinned into the ECU, I could figure out what that pin in the ECU was for, and kind of use that to trace back what the plug coming into the ECU was used for, if that makes sense. So way back early on, I was able to get a complete pin out of the ECU, all 60 pins, I believe it is, for this one. And so I labeled every single wire coming out of the ECU for what that wire is for. Like sensor ground this, or check engine light this, or whatever. And that was super helpful, so I could trace back what wire was for what. And so I did that. And in the situation where neither one of those was possible, if the wire didn't terminate at the ECU plug, or if I didn't know what the coloring was for, or couldn't find it anywhere in this manual, basically all of that together told me that I probably didn't need the circuit that it is. And so I kind of gambled on a few of those things and removed those. And it's really hard to find some specific things like that if you don't have the donor vehicle to know what exactly was plugged onto. And so I was also able to go to a pick and pull yard from LKQ, and I looked it up online. You can see if they have the right vehicle there. I looked it up online. They had a 92 Ranger just like mine, same spec, well, just like the stuff that I got from, same spec and everything. And I was able to go there and see some of the wiring actually in place. Luckily, most of it was still intact. Not much had been harvested from this specific truck. And so I was able to try to see, okay, well, this connector goes down this direction, and this connector's over here, and blah, 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 blah. So, that was really helpful, too, to be able to kind of see what it was actually on the truck. So, that's kind of my process of how I went through and how I eliminated circuits. And I'm pretty sure I did it right, but I guess we'll see.
All right, guys. So I think I have just about everything out of the harness, for right now anyway, that I don't need. I've made a giant pile over there of wiring that I don't need. A lot of this is headlight stuff. Some of it's transmission control stuff. Just a whole bunch of stuff that I know I'm specifically not going to need on this. So one major thing that I couldn't find was the pinout for this main plug right here. And so this one connected to a handful of these wires sitting right here, as well as some other ones of the wires sitting over there. And this plugged basically into the firewall and interfaced with the inside wiring of the truck to connect from that to like the engine stuff here, which is mainly just like the power distribution harness. So I couldn't find the pinout for that, which meant that all the wires that went into it with these little bullet connectors on them, I didn't know what any one of them did, which is frustrating. I bought a manual here to help me out. This is a 92 Ranger electrical and vacuum troubleshooting manual. I found this one on eBay for like 10 or 15 bucks or something, and it is insanely helpful. I found a lot of these diagrams online, but the nice thing about this is that it tells you what the connector number is, and then you can look in the back here on location, and it tells you, some of the stuff about what the connector is for, which is insanely helpful, and I'm very happy I got this to figure out. Well, that book still didn't have the pinout for this main firewall plug, which is fine because it had the instrument cluster wiring. So I know that a lot of these wires that I need are ones that are going to go to the instrument cluster or to the ignition switch. Those are really the only two interfaces that I would need. So some of these here that I knew went to the cluster based on what the wiring on the back of the instrument cluster said. I could figure out what they were here. So like this one, for instance, this tan and red is a check engine light. So I know that if I want to keep the check engine light, which I do, then I can use this wire to tell me what light the check engine light is, which is cool. So I took out all the other wires from that plug that I didn't need and labeled all the ones that I know I need and what they are. That was kind of how I went about that. And then I marked a few of the other stuff that I know I'm going to remove. I just put a tape with a little X on there to remove the wiring, and then I can take the whole bundle apart, remove those wires, and then clean the harness back up. So basically now my plan is to take the whole wiring harness back out, pull all the rest of the loom off and stuff, and pull all the wiring, or pull all the electrical tape and stuff off, and then remove the entire circuits that I don't want. And I'll lay it back in here before I finalize the loom, and that way I can kind of pull the wiring where I want it to go instead. Like, I don't think I want this coming all the way around the front. I think I can actually snake it back inside the cabin and do it under the dash there, and then the plug that interfaces it with it right here can actually run back and into it there instead. So I also kind of want to try to tuck as much of the wiring as I can to try to make it look less like it's a wiring nightmare. And then, yeah, so that's the next thing I'm going to do. Boom. Now the harness is not in the car anymore and is now over on the bench. So, like I showed earlier, some of these wires, like this for instance, I marked with an X, and so I'm going to basically take more of the harness apart here and take the entire wiring out that's labeled as X, and then maybe shorten some of the ones that I know I want to shorten. That's what I'm going to do, and I'll update you when I'm done. Alright, so I'm sorry if this video is kind of jumping around or whatever, but this has kind of been over a few weeks worth of work going in and out of the car, and so basically I'm going to go through all the connectors here that I have left in the harness. I've got everything else removed that I don't want in there, and I've stripped the harness, taken all those circuits out, put it back in the car, figured out where I wanted to route it, and got it to route really pretty cleanly, so now what I'm going to do is re-loom everything. So once I had it in the car, I shortened everything. Well, I marked where I wanted to shorten, and I really only had to shorten one major thing, which was the coolant temp sensor. This these two right here. So I just put some connectors in there, and basically those ran all the way through and back out to there, and I didn't really need all that. So in the car, I just looped that, marked it, and then in here on the bench, I chopped it and put some connectors in there, and made it way cleaner, and removed the connector. There's no reason for the connector to be there. The connector originally had a few other things going through it, I guess, that I removed and I don't need. Basically, I'm going to go through again here what I have laid out here. So I'll start with the ECU connector right there. That'll be inside the car. This whole mess right here will be inside the car under the dash, hopefully hidden away relatively well. I've got my ECU power relay, my fuel pump power relay. I've got the OBD1 connector with the little test pin, and so this will all be inside the car. I had some extra length here, so what I did was I just put a big loop in it, and I'm just going to probably leave this alone. I don't really want to cut all of those wires and splice them all back together. It's just kind of asking for trouble, so I'm just going to leave it a loop like that, and it should be able to hide it under the dash somewhere. Then I've got my power going back to my fuel pump there, and then right about in here is where the firewall will be. So I'll have to either put a grommet here. Ideally, I'd like to put it, like, cut all this and then pin all this into two connectors so that I could leave all this inside the car and take out just the engine harness. But for now, I'll probably just kind of leave that how it is, especially just to be able to test it all and stuff. So from there, it goes over to kind of the passenger side where I've got a few grounds. This would originally have gone to the original negative battery terminal. I'm going to put that to chassis ground, and then I'll ground the battery in the back of the car, and then I'll run the power wire up to here. So this will basically just be a chassis ground now. This is going to my O2 sensor down around my exhaust. There's an extension that hooks onto there, and then I'll have to probably heat wrap the extension that goes on there, plugs into the O2 sensor, self-explanatory. Mass airflow sensor, and then I got my IAT sensor, intake air temp. Those will both be right there in the air box that you're going to see soon. And so then that's that little leg. Coming around here, this next connector here is mainly some powers and the alternator field. That'll go into the charging harness, which I have disconnected right now. The charging and power harness is kind of separate. That's really the only interface right there. And it would have connected into those grounds right there as well. But so I have that disconnected right now. I'm going to change it up a little bit because of how I want to mount the starter relay, the power distribution box, and having the battery in the back. It kind of changes all that. So I may as well just run new power wires for all that anyway. So that's my main disconnect right there. And then coming up here, I've got a TPS, throttle position sensor, that will be, this is kind of at the back of the engine now. So it'll be right there. That's the TPS plug right there. So that comes right over. This will kind of be mounted on the firewall. I've got my oil pressure sensor, and then this run here goes over to my ignition coils. So this is the rear coil. This will be the front coil with my condenser. And then this goes to the coolant temp sensor, which will be kind of under the ignition coils right there. And this is the only one this is the wire that I had to shorten. Coming back to the main harness and traveling down, we've kind of got a mess right here, and hopefully I can be able to clean it up. It looks kind of messy, mostly just because there's so many zip ties and stuff kind of holding everything in the orientation. But this right here is a main disconnect for ignition. Mainly, it's got a few other things in there as well, but you can see it kind of loops back on itself. I don't really need this connector, but I'm not going to remove it just simply for the fact that it would be more work than I think it's really worth, and I can kind of hide it under the intake manifold. It will look relatively clean. These two right here go to my crank position sensor. The main plug here goes to the crank position sensor, and I believe this is like a sensor ground or something for that. And then this goes to, it's mostly got the injectors on it, but it's kind of a sub harness that has the injectors and the idle air control valve, and I think there's something else in there too, I can't remember right now. And then carrying on, we've got a shorting bar, or actually this one's just an empty blank. I'm not positive what it's for, but I don't want to remove it. It's not listed on the ignition tables, but I think it's something to test the ignition. I'm not positive. Then there's also this shorting bar, which I'm not going to remove because it is, I'm pretty sure, to test the ignition system. If somebody knows down below, you can comment and tell me what these two exactly do, because I'm not super familiar and I can't find a whole lot of info. But carrying on, we've got the ignition control module at the top and the ignition control module bottom. You can see right here I lengthened all of these wires because all of the wires going into the pins there, into the actual plug, were really destroyed, and I could not find the correct pins. So I decided to just add a length of wire, solder and heat shrink everything together, and then call it good. So even though I have all black wires right here, it's pinned correctly. Going back to the main harness here, carries on, and then this will go through the firewall again, kind of over by the pedal assembly, and it has some other controls in there and sensors as well. These two wires right here originally would have gone down to like by the trans tunnel, along with another big 16 pin connector to go to the transmission control, and I'm obviously not going to use any of that, so these are just going to basically be grounds. Now I'll put these to a chassis ground. I'm just leaving it extra long so I can kind of run it wherever I want to. And that's pretty much it, really. I've got ignition system, injector system, as well as a few of the sensors that the ECU needs, and as well as gauges would need. So, yeah, that's really pretty much it. It's not as complicated as it seems. It's pretty tricky and kind of intimidating. But that's really it. And now cut back to this clip when the car won't start because I took out something I didn't need. Let's hope that doesn't happen. So next what I'm going to do is go through, relume and retape everything. I have some Tessa tape and some regular electrical tape, and I'm going to try to reuse as much of the stock loom as I can, just to kind of conserve money, not spend a whole bunch of money on stuff. So that's what I'm going to do. All right, so here's a quick little look at some of the wiring. This is the ignition control module over here. So I got the top plug and the bottom plug, and then some of this kind of can be tucked in a way, but a lot of it's still kind of just sitting here on the open, which I'm kind of okay with. I think it looks fine as it is. So there's a little sub harness that plugs into the injectors and a couple of the sensors down there. And then this little branch just goes back off into the through the firewall, and that has like my ignition on and things like that. Check engine light. I got my grounds going down there. I haven't secured them anywhere yet, but they will get a place at some point. And then you can see the harness kind of goes back around the engine there. So come back over here. Ignore the battery and some of the extra stuff here. This is to test to see what's going on here. But then the harness that I did comes around the valve cover here and comes up to the two ignition coils. I have the little lead that goes off to the throttle position sensor, and then for the most part, the rest of it goes back into there. I've got the little lead, the little run that comes off of here for my O2 sensor, IAT sensor, and my MAF plug, which will all be right here. Not the battery. The battery will be in the back. My fuse block there and starter relay, they're kind of just roughly mounted for right now to test some stuff. But that's pretty much it. And then the rest of the stuff comes through the car and kind of sits in here. I'll probably find some way to locate and mount the ECU instead of just kind of sitting there. But otherwise, yeah, that'll be most of the wires coming through.
With that, guys, that's going to be wrap on this video. Thank you so much for sticking through it and watching the whole thing. I really appreciate it. There'll be a couple more videos coming out soon. One on this super cool airbox, it's over there, that I built and 3D printed. Well, the adapter for whatever. You'll see that coming up. And yeah, I mean, my goal is to still be able to drive this thing before the end of the year. And if that only means moving it an inch, I'm calling that a win. So we're getting closer to that point, but I still have a lot of stuff left to do before that could happen. So stick with it, and we'll get through it. Thanks, guys. We'll see you later.